So it's really a privilege to be here at Passive House Ma and present in front of such a accomplished group. So I mean, James goes back to really the OG of Passive House design together with Michelle. How about a shout out to Michelle, kind of the original OGs of Passive House design. So thank you. But it's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. So for those that don't know me, my name's Paul, and I'm an engineer with the Department of Energy Resources, the DOER, here at the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the DOER is the state's energy office, and one of our responsibilities is building decarbonization and building energy codes. So that's those two things are what I work on. So what I'd like to do for this evening, spend most of the time on part one here, which is some perspective about Massachusetts building energy code. When we are working with our noses down and thinking about Passive House all day long, we may forget, we're sort of very focused on our specialized code, which has in it the mandatory Passive House for multifamily. And what I'd like to do this evening is just kind of lay the groundwork a little bit more information about how our code works, and to hopefully leave you with the impression that there's way more opportunity for Passive House in Massachusetts than just multifamilies in specialized code communities. So let's begin with kind of a refresher. For those that may be new to Massachusetts, we have 3 code tiers that each individual city and municipality can choose to be in. So every city or town has to be at least on the base code, which is the lowest tier. It's based on IECC 2021 model code. And then we have two tiers from that, the stretch code, which is more ambitious, and the specialized code, which is even more ambitious. So each city and town gets to choose which bin they want to be in. And what's terrific about all the work that my colleagues at the DOER have been doing for, the better part of, a decade and a half, is that almost all of Massachusetts is on at least the stretch code, and many are now on the specialized code. And again, I just want to point out, as Passive House practitioners, we're focused a lot on the specialized code, because that's where the Passive House mandatory for multifamily rules are. But I want to point your attention to the fact that 92% of Massachusetts by population is in a stretch code or specialized code tier. So there's only 8% of the population that is not in one of those two things. And that's really important for you to think about as you think about where we go from here in terms of application of Passive House. So let me explain that just a little further. So let's go one deeper on how our code works. So it used to be that we had a base code and then a specialized code, and a base code and a stretch code. And the stretch code was like, you just kind of turn a dial a little bit and it was slightly better. But the stretch code that we now have, has been in place for a couple of years now, is a step difference than the base. So it's quite different from IECC 2021. It's based on IECC 2021 plus a bunch of amendments. And those amendments make the IECC code into the Massachusetts Thermal Code. And the Massachusetts Thermal Code is in both the specialized tier and in the stretch tier equally. So what is a thermal code? A thermal code is a very big departure from the way that we used to do stretch codes and the way that the rest of the country still does stretch codes. And Canada and provinces, we're the only state in the United States that has done this. So the traditional way to do a stretch code is to say, okay, build a building to your normal standard, figure out what the total energy use is, and then reduce that by some percent. And that will be the stretch, that some percent reduction. And I want to point out here, it's the total energy use of the building, which means, the heating, the cooling, but it's also the lights, the fans, things of that nature. So one of the strategies that you can use, for example, to meet stretch code is to improve lighting. And that's what was commonly done. And that's what's still commonly done in other states. The Massachusetts stretch code, the one that we have now, that's about 2 years old, the new stretch code that we're now in, doesn't look at total energy use reduction like that. What it does is it targets specifically space heating reduction and also space cooling reduction. So it's very targeted. And one of the things that you'll notice if you apply this across different building prototypes is that the thermal code, the provisions that make it a thermal code that we have in our stretch and specialized, they really reduce the space heating by a lot. It's not a 10 or 20% reduction like we're used to with stretch codes. It's a 90% reduction. We like to say that it crushes the space heating because that's what it does. When you apply the thermal code stuff to our stretch and specialized from the base, there's very little heating left to do. It's a really important point to remember. So let me just back up a little bit on the story of our stretch and specialized that we have now. Why did we make that change from the old way of doing stretch codes with the percent better total energy reduction to the new way focused on space heating reduction and space cooling reduction? The reason this goes back to just asking ourselves a question about what do we want our building energy codes to do? So traditionally, it's simply, we want to reduce energy use, right? The overall energy use. But with decarbonization and other issues that we're now facing here as a society, we have an opportunity to have even better building codes than just reducing overall energy use, right? We have an opportunity to make them more comfortable, more resilient. If we have better envelopes, we can reduce and simplify the HVAC system so there's less moving parts. But we also have an opportunity to have what we call grid-friendly electrification. So when we researched, okay, if we want to achieve energy efficiency in these 4 things, especially the last one, the grid-friendly electrification, what do we want our stretch code to do? And what we quickly realized is that using reduce the overall load by some 10, 20% is not going to cut it, because all you can do is you just adjust the lighting and you're done. That doesn't help you at all with respect to any of those 4 other missions. And that if you want to achieve greatness on these other 4 missions, you have to also reduce the space heating in particular. And what's terrific is that you get really, really powerful results. So this result here, this is worth tens of billions of dollars to the state of Massachusetts. Tens of billions of less money paid for by ratepayers into our utilities. So let me just explain this plot a little bit. What this shows a school being built to new construction, and it shows the imposition on the electric grid due to space cooling and space heating from that building. So on the one labeled model code, that shows the imposition of the grid from the way we used to do buildings for many decades here in Massachusetts. We would build a high school, for example. We would cool it with electricity using a compression cycle, and then we would heat it with gas. So the imposition on the electric grid was 50 kilowatts in the summer, and the imposition on the electric grid in the winter was 0 because it was heated with gas. Now the middle is what everyone is now doing, right? Which is we're electrifying our space heating. So we're taking our gas space heating and we're replacing it with heat pumps, right? Now, if you use the model codes like IECC 2021, IECC 2024, all the even ASHRAE, updated ASHRAE, doesn't matter. If you use one of those, they are not thermal codes. They are not crushing space heating. So if we swap from gas to electric, the plot looks like what you see under the middle pair. And that is the space cooling imposition doesn't change, that's the same. But because I've now swapped from gas to electric heat pumps, my peak load on the grid in the winter is now multiple times bigger than the summer peak load. And this is what's being done all over the North America, all the other states, all the other provinces of Canada. unless you actually reduce the thermal load of buildings, that's going to be the result. And then what you have to do is you have to do tens of billions of dollars of upgrades to your grids to support new construction. So the alternative is to crush the space heating with a good thermal code. That's the last pair. Reduce that space heating by 90% first and then electrify. That's why a thermal code is so important. We had New Building Institute analyze this for us, and we gave them the demographics of what we expect to build in Massachusetts for the next 10 years. And we said, if we built it to IECC 2021 and we heated everything with gas, what is the grid, electric grid that we need to support that? And they came up with this much. And then we said, we build the same exact things, but built to the thermal code. And instead of using gas for space heating, we use heat pumps. What is the electric grid needed in that scenario? And the answer was, for this one, it was 5% bigger grid. Now, when the utilities do this kind of work, they're potentially using just the middle bar. They're going to come up with a number much, much bigger than 5%, right? So we need to sort of make an intervention here to remind everyone that the space heating and the demand in the winter is not going to be what you expect it to be because we crushed the space heating in the first place. The resilience, I think, speaks for itself when it comes to thermal codes. So one of the last sort of like holdout ideas to resist using heat pumps and space heating is if I lose power, my building will get cold, so I need backup heating. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to worry about if you use IECC 2021 or none of these non-thermal codes, because those buildings will get cold very quickly. But if you build to a thermal code standard, like Massachusetts stretch code standard, your building will not get cold because the backup is the envelope. The envelope is the backup. We don't need to have HVAC systems solve that problem for us when the envelope does it for us. So how do we get thermal codes? As passive house people, it's the 4 pillars, right? You have to have a quality envelope, so your U value, low air infiltration, ventilation energy recovery, thermal bridge mitigation. That's like all building sciences boiled down to one slide. Those 4 pillars is what delivers 90% reduction in space heating and all those benefits. And if you look at what the model codes have in them, they sort of do everything except those 4 things. Arguably, they're doing better at the air infiltration because that has been introduced in 2021. But in ASHRAE, you can trade away your envelope performance as much as you want with no limit. And that's how we have lots of buildings that have very poor envelope performance. But they're reducing the lighting, so they're getting an overall reduction. They might be increasing the space heating along the way. I've seen that. Ventilation energy recovery in model code is still very low standards. And there has been a very small baby step to address thermal bridge mitigation in 2024 IECC, but it's not comprehensive at all. It's nothing like what we have in the Massachusetts thermal code or in passive house practice. So I'm bringing all this back because, again, the reason for giving you all this context is to really demonstrate how passive house opportunities exist for you in ways that maybe you don't. Hopefully you can appreciate leaving this presentation. So those 4 pillars are baked into both the stretched and the specialized. So again, specialized gets a lot of play because that's where the passive house from multifamily lives. But the 4 pillars themselves live in both the stretch and specialized code equally. And they both accomplish that 90% reduction in all of their benefits, okay? And what I want to point out here is that those 4 pillars are then pretty much universally mandatory throughout almost all of Massachusetts. So it's not just the specialized, it's the stretch and the specialized. And when you compare, if you talk to other states and you have discussions about what it takes to be passive house, to go passive house, and they're talking about how much more does it cost, well, how much more do we have to do, what is the implications to the project? The baseline in IECC and those other states is way over on one side of this bridge here. So because the IECC is not a thermal code, you have to do a lot of thermal code stuff to get to passive house, right? Where here in Massachusetts, the thermal code has already gotten you a lot of the way to actually being passive house. So if we go back to looking at where's this thermal code apply and how ubiquitous it is, it's everywhere. So your ambitions maybe so far have been passive house, multifamily in the specialized code towns. Terrific, let's keep doing that. But I want you to consider that if you have a passive house in Shrewsbury or Hudson or Woburn or some other stretch code town that's not specialized, passive house isn't mandatory there for multifamily, but the 4 pillars are mandatory. So the gap between what's mandatory and passive house is way smaller than the perception would lead you to believe if you are comparing to model codes. Further, those 4 pillars are mandatory for all building types. So I want you to consider a future where passive house is, we associate with multifamily. How about passive house for schools, for office, for all building types? Because again, the 4 pillars are mandatory for all building types. So if you're doing a school in a stretch code town, there may be a very small gap, much smaller than you may think, between where you're required to go and passive house. So just something, food for thought for you. So incentives, I just wanted to point out some key change here in that the passive house incentive for 5 units or more from Mass Save has increased to 3,750 when you're all in. So that's a terrific increase. And there's a larger Mass Save change that you need to pay attention to, which is, I think starting this past summer, Mass Save no longer allows you to get their rebates if you include gas in your new construction project. There is a couple of exceptions to that. One of them happens to be 5 units more of multifamily. You're still allowed to use gas for service water heating. I would say watch that space though, because that's kind of our next mission at DOER is let's keep working on that and seeing if we can make heat pump, air source heat pump water heating or solar thermal water heating, electric backup, the norm. And then we can have Mass Save perhaps review again whether we would even allow gas in those situations. So I just want to point that out. And then the other new thing with passive house and the rebates is the fact that there is a passive house rebate now for single families and 2 through 4 units, which didn't used to exist. This is new. And those are pretty generous. In this one, there is no exception to that no gas rule because it's viewed that it's a simpler application, 1, 2, 3, 4 units, not hard to get air source heat pump in there compared to say an apartment building. So those are no gas. Okay, so something you may not be as familiar with is PACE. So let's talk about PACE for a moment and then we'll connect it back to passive house for a moment. So PACE financing has been around for a long time, and it's a really simple idea to try to break that split incentive, as they call it. So say I'm a building developer, I'm building a multifamily, I have to buy some land, I put up some money for that, put some utilities and put up some money for that. That's the cost of the land on the site. And then I have to put more money into building my actual building from the ground up, so to speak. And that's the cost of building that you see there. So what Massachusetts now has is a program that says, if you build that building to passive house standards, and it may actually be mandatory, or you'd be very close to mandatory in stretch code, you're allowed to finance that with PACE. So my experience as a developer would go like this. I would build my multifamily to passive house standards, and I would get a bank to finance, say, 35% of the cost of building. And then the bank gives me that money and I spend the money and then I'm done. And then as a developer, let's just say they're condos, I walk away from that debt. That debt is not on me, the developer. The debt is on the building users that are paying taxes. So the 35% is amortized and paid back by the taxpayer of the building, the local taxes, over a period of 20 years. So when you look at that, it's almost a no-brainer to do passive house. Like passive house isn't just worthy to do because it's the same cost. It actually just simply costs less. When you consider maybe with or without incentives, I think it would still cost less than not doing passive house, even in the stretch code community. Once you consider the fact that you can finance 35% and walk away from it and not have to pay that back, you just took 35% off the cost of the building for you. So that's a pretty powerful incentive. I just want to clarify one thing. This has nothing to do with what's incentivized in this PACE. Has nothing to do with what it took to make a passive house. It's real or perceived. It's simply a percent of the cost of the building that is documented by a construction manager. And there's no distinction between whether that cost was, to build the building as normal or to build a building as passive. It's nothing to do with that. It's just simply that if you build a passive house standard, then you qualify for this. So PACE is now in place. It needs to be approved by each city and town. And this is where it is so far. The agency that is in charge of PACE explains that if you have a project that you'd like to do with PACE that's not on this list, basically that's when they would intervene with the city and get PACE arranged for that city or town. So they're just prioritizing where PACE wants to go next. So that's not necessarily a limit. So hopefully we'll see these just increase and increase over time. Important code changes, I just want to end with this. So code changes that go into effect on Friday is that these are changes to the code that we put in place 2 years ago. There's a bunch of amendments we just finished that go into effect on Friday. Documentation better aligns with FIAS and PHI processes. This is a really important one. The final certification now has an oops clause. So it basically allows you to get your certificate of occupancy without having to meet all the passive house standards if that was some sort of hang up. Now you would not get your Mass Save rebate nor your PACE financing. So it's a sort of punishing allowance, but it's meant to prevent a disaster. So we don't have a building that can't be occupied. And then finally, the EnerFit standard has been officially added as a compliance method for Chapter 5 existing buildings. So I'll just end with this. I was reflecting with some of the OGs that did passive house that I think it was 7 years ago, it might have been 5 years ago, that there was one passive house in Massachusetts, and now there's over 20,000. That's thanks to you. And hopefully we'll see some acceleration of even that, as I said, with the thermal code standard as basically universal. That gap between what's already required for all building types and passive houses is a lot smaller than you may know. And then coupled with incentives, coupled with CPACE financing, it starts to be like hard to not do passive house in those circumstances. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I guess we have some time for some questions, right?
Thank you so much, Paul. We're going to be using this mic for questions. We're going to alternate between questions in person and questions from the chat online. So is there anyone in the room who wants to start us off? Here we go. And if you could just introduce yourself for the record.
My name is Amy Lotfacoco. I'm an architect and I'm the chair of the BSA Committee on the Environment. Hi, Paul. Thanks so much for your lecture tonight. Really great to hear. As we saw with the EPA, Department of Environmental Protection, having funding, losing funding, having funding again, and then not getting commentary on where that is. In terms of Mass Save funding, is that in the crosshairs of the federal government?
No, we are entirely on our own little ship. So Mass Save is funded through the electric and gas utilities. So when you pay your electric or gas bill, if you actually look at it, you'll see a little, $6 or something that you're paying in each bill. And that is where the money comes from that is then distributed to Massachusetts projects that are in those program administrators' service areas. So it's nothing to do with federal government. Great question.
And now we'll take one from the chat.
So David Solomon on the chat is asking, has the process for writing and adopting the stretch codes in Massachusetts been memorialized in writing as a toolkit that people in other states can use to further this kind of work?
Yes, we have a terrific report written by Stephen Winters and Joe Happold, BR+A, New Building Institute. So that contains kind of all the thought processes, data, research that went into everything I just described about thermal codes and passive house. And that is something that we can share with Passive House Mass and distribute widely. And then part of the reason I'm here today is to kind of keep getting that message out about what that process was and what we did so that we can repeat it in other places.
And we'd be glad to help distribute it and help that process along in other states.
I think Michelle had a question.
It's kind of a follow on the incentives, so almost it's hard not to, right? For so many reasons. Not every municipality has the opportunity to take advantage of the incentives because not every municipality is using those utilities. So has there been conversation about how to handle those that are using municipal power and don't have anything near the same incentive?
Yes, so let's back up just a moment to explain how this works. So the mass save incentives are associated with the program administrators, we call them the PAs, that participate in mass save. So that's like Eversource, National Grid, Cape Light Compound, like the list of like the big utilities. So the municipal utilities, so like Wakefield has its own light plant. So they're not Eversource, they're not National Grid. So if you're a municipality, if you're a muni like that, those ratepayers are not paying into mass save and they do not then qualify for mass save. So those munis are throughout the state. The good news is that I think it's kind of like all the big cities are not munis. So that's good. So where a lot of construction occurs, it's a non-issue, but if you go into the burbs, this can come up. So there's I'm not familiar with that stuff. There might be that discussion going on. I have to go back and learn more about plans for munis and rebates and things. But just to point out that the CPACE has nothing to do with that. So CPACE can be anywhere in Massachusetts, and that's sort of might solve the problem because that is a giant incentive that actually dwarfs the mass save incentive if you consider that you don't have to pay that back as a developer.
Great, we've got another question from the chat. Catherine Duff with Studio to Sustain is asking about single family homes. When is the incentive paid to the owner?
Oh, so if you go back to here. Oh, for single family is a little different. I don't know the details of that. So I know in multifamily, you do a preliminary modeling and then you get an initial incentive. And then at the end with the CO, you get the full incentive. I don't know how it works for single family. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that question adequately.
We'll find out. We'll distribute the answer afterwards.
We'll have to find out. Thank you.
Hi, Lauren Bellman from NHP. A question on the CPACE. So I know traditionally CPACE has been very hard for affordable housing to be able to take advantage of because of subordination requirements within the context of the debt, the capital stack. Are you seeing any improvement around that in terms of being able to leverage a CPACE methodology for affordable housing finance?
I don't have I can't answer that question. That's not something that I'm familiar with. I'm familiar with the issue, but I'm not familiar with what progress is being made. So I'd have to find out more. So let me do that and we can share what we learned. Good question.
Okay, great. We've got another one from the chat with Mark Sendine is asking, can you talk about the pros and cons of heating multifamily buildings with central HVAC versus individual heat pumps for each unit? And there's a part B of the question. Related question, what do you expect heat loads to be for passive house multifamily apartment in BTUs per hour for a 1,000 square foot unit?
Pop quiz.
I was told there'd be no math. Oh, boy, okay. So, maybe Mark and I can have a Zoom call, because I know Mark well, and I, would love to chat in depth about this. So I think you could do a whole class in advantages and disadvantages of, you know, split type systems versus, VRF type systems that do floors or parts of floors versus more centralized systems, that are, you know, are sending. So there's just a lot of different permutations. As your building gets bigger, the split systems become a little bit, you know, aren't as necessarily as ideal. That's something that you might see in you know, a small multifamily townhouse type of application. But it's worth, I think, maybe a one-on-one type call for that particular question. And I can't answer the other question about BTUs. Sorry, not on the spot like this.
I could neither, so.
Jay Lee from the City of Boston. Could you explain the base thing a little more? You're talking about home ownership, right? Because you said for sale housing.
Can you repeat that again?
You talked about the pace, the 30%, I know, mortgage that will be put on the overall building. Can you talk about that structure a little more? Because I don't see how the developer can walk away from the 30%.
Yes, so if I'm a developer of multifamily housing and I'm building condos. So if let's just say the cost of my building is, you know, 10 million, right? I can finance 35% of that. So, you know, 3.5 million, with a bank. The bank will come up with that money instead of me. So the amount I have to come up with is now reduced, and I've taken that off what I have to come up with as a developer, and a bank comes up with that amount. Now I sell those condos and I use the proceeds to pay off the debt I took on, which would be the other 65%, the other 6.5 million, right? And then I profit, and then I walk away. And the 3.5 million that was financed by the bank is paid for by the condo owners over 20 years.
Stays with the property taxes. It's paid back through the property taxes. So whoever's paying the property taxes.
So you have a source, you have another mortgage as the developer for the bank. Oh, it's not a mortgage loan or something?
Yeah, so the amount that I financed is attached to the property. The developer, I sold the condos, I walk away. That debt stays with the property and it runs with the land. It doesn't matter how many more times it's sold, it runs with the land. And the owners of those condos pay back that loan over a period of 20 years through their local taxes.
So they have a tax increase?
So they would be, their tax bill would include the regular taxes that everyone pays in Boston. And there would be on top of that, an amount that is paying back that loan.
So we would figure that into how much they could borrow for their own mortgage.
Yes, they would have to be part of what they would.
So it'd be increasing their mortgage.
They would increase the mortgage, yeah. Well, it would, but potentially not increase total costs, because the building built without passive house would have had a certain amount of heating and cooling costs. But now built to passive house, those heating and cooling costs go down. Now, and then then amortizing that debt over 20 years, that amortized debt could actually be smaller than, could be smaller than the savings that were incurred as a result of being passive house. Yeah. So you come out ahead from day one.
From the day one costs what people have to do to get a mortgage.
We can also share some information about CPACE. This is actually currently undergoing some revisions, so we can share some information out afterwards and continue that conversation.
Thanks for running the mic. Hope you have your running shoes on. So we do have a few more questions coming up in the chat here. But we'll continue to bounce back and forth with the live audience too. So Luke McNeely did pop into the chat to say that all passive house final incentives are after the final certification is complete. So he's talking about the single family residential question that came up. They're documented and then submitted to Mass Save. James, did you want to answer that calculation question? You want to? And then I've got another question from James.
And we're not gonna mess with laws of nature.
No, I was gonna say, don't change the properties of water.
I won't.
Because it hasn't happened
I was
yet.
joking, I'm not gonna do that. But the answer to the question, he was asking, I'm gonna assume he's asking for peak heat loss, which is how much energy does it take to heat 1,000 square foot apartment when the conditions outdoors are peak, which is 9 degrees in Boston. So the round number is 5 BTUs per square foot. So times 1,000, that'd be 5,000. So just to put that in context, the rule of thumb with my peers is 35. So what we talk about this all day long with clients, what we often see is just dramatically oversized systems by a factor of 3 or 4. And when it comes to air source heat pumps, they don't work when they're oversized. Sometimes you can get away with oversized stuff, and if nobody knows, it works, so you don't get in trouble. You can't get away with that in air source heat pumps, and we're helping clients deal with dramatically oversized applications. Unfortunately, the enclosure is great, and the mechanical system is a train wreck. But I did have a question. Hope that answers Mark's question. Okay. All right, that was a comment.
Great, thanks. And then there's a question, if a multifamily building is certified to passive house, is it safe to say it would qualify for Energy Star certification as well? And I would like to take that real quick, because I can say that under FIAS, it automatically would be certified to Energy Star. And if it's certified to the Passive House Institute, the PHI standard, it is not reliant on Energy Star certification.
I won't hold that answer some questions.
No, that was terrific. Let's get some more.
Okay. You know, we haven't taken yet. Spoken here.
This is really just a clarification regarding rental development. Is there anything in the pipeline to assist in that regard? CPACE or otherwise?
Well, you can, CPACE can still be used for rentals. There's nothing preventing that. It's just like the money is gonna be a little different. Now, I mean, a building owner can include heat and space conditioning as part of the rent. So there is a way for a building owner to avail themselves of CPACE benefits and include that in the rent with the inclusion of space heating, and they would find that their utilities are very small because it's passive house. So there's a bunch of different ways you can skin that cat.
Great, I've got one from Nicole Berger with Innova. So she first comments, repurposing historic buildings like mills and schools to house vulnerable populations requires careful consideration of tenant health and safety. When changing occupancy in this way, are HERS ratings or compartmentalization required by the new stretch code? Ensuring tenants don't share air is critical, and we know that demising walls are often a weak point in these projects. Failing to test for air leakage is a missed opportunity to guarantee healthy living spaces for all. So the question is around repurposing and testing for compartmentalization.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why we included EnerFit as an explicit pathway for chapter 5, which is reuse of existing buildings. And we would definitely like to see more work done on EnerFit and reuse of buildings and bring them to passive house type standards as well. So I've talked a lot about new construction here, but that is definitely of interest to us as well. In fact, this week we do have DOE national grant money for this, which is, to your first question, that has now become stalled, but we do have significant grants that we landed at the DOER to work specifically on existing buildings. So our vision was to create a thermal code for existing buildings. We have one for new buildings, and so it would follow a similar thing. It would allow passive house itself, EnerFit, et cetera, but also have other pathways that were alternatives to those that people could use for existing buildings. But that at the moment, that work hasn't been able to start because of the DOE has been unable to unlock that money for the moment. So call your representatives.
Do you have some recommendations for existing buildings that we could talk about here?
Yeah, so the EnerFit standard, if you're not familiar with that, that's in C506, that is a passive house standard for existing buildings. And it has a lot of history. It's been proven. So it's a very, very well thought out standard. So that's what I would use at this time for existing buildings, if you wanted to achieve a passive house type of performance.
There we go. I do have one more from the chat. This is Mark Arnoldy. Can you provide some background on why the passive house requirement for multifamily was limited to the specialized code? Could you see this moving to the stretch code in future iterations, or are there factors preventing this?
That's a great question. I mean, we were developing the code that we have now 5 years ago. And I think 5 years ago, we had like maybe 30 units of passive house in Massachusetts. You know, we went from 1 to 30, like between 7 years ago and 5 years ago, and now from 30 to 20,000. So at the time, there wasn't a lot of built passive house in Massachusetts. It was really just a handful of buildings, right? Literally a handful. And so I think that was maybe the reason it got limited to the specialized code. And the other thing to remember about the stretch code is that when we update the stretch code, and any city and town that's already a stretch code municipality, they get the updates automatically. So we didn't want too many new things to be automatically applied to 92% of Massachusetts. So the specialized became a good way for us to introduce something that was basically completely new for the cities and towns to then decide if they wanted to undertake that. And I was surprised that within a couple of months, we had a bunch of cities and towns already lined up to be specialized, not in spite of the passive house being mandatory, but because of it. Actually became like the reason people adopted specialized. So that was kind of a cool thing that happened. So I'd say that was really the #1 reason why it wasn't applied from the get-go, because we wanted to be a choice for people. And now that we have this terrific success of Passive House in specialize and growing this community, I think that that's an open question, I think that could be asked. So the next time that we update our code, certainly we would be looking for advocates of code to suggest to us what should we do next. And that would be something that would be, I think, a worthwhile suggestion. And then our leadership would decide what to do with that. But today, remember, again, today, already, the thermal code that's built into the stretch code as it exists now, again, to be a total, like, broken horse here, and repeat myself again and again, that gets you very far to Passive House in stretch code for all building types. So that's like, just if you take away nothing else from this night, take away that.
Well, thank you. That's actually a very good segue into one thing I had to ask you to confirm. Acknowledge 92% of communities in Massachusetts thermal code here on out. The remaining 8% is my understanding from the latest updates of the BBRS work. Passive House still accepted statewide as compliance. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
I don't think it's enough attention.
Yes, you can use Passive House as a compliance path in any situation for any building type, in any location.
And the last quick question that I'm surprised no one asked it. How's the progress with the trademark of crushing thermal nodes going?
I've been getting regular checks. Every time someone says crushing space heating, I get paid $10. So yeah, I'm looking at an island right now.
We'll try and get some t-shirts made. We can
That'd be great.
look into that.
Rick Hedner, Stantec. Since we have you, can you tell us what's coming next in the stretch code, since it is, previously it's been a progression of getting more and more better and better. Now we've made this huge leap. Can't imagine the next version of this is a even huge leap, or maybe it will be. We're crushing cooling loads too additionally, or do you have a sense of what's next? Since you've been working on this one for 5 years.
Yeah, there's been really no discussions about what's next for new construction. That's a discussion that really hasn't started. The focus of the administration at the moment is to create delivery mechanisms. So pace is a huge priority. So getting pace out there, having people take advantage of pace, the linkage of pace to Passive House, like all that was revised recently. So that's like the next thing. Is like keep removing obstacles from Passive House or from application of thermal code is kind of the MO right now. And then as a side, we are not satisfied with the way that we have to do code for existing buildings, and that we need to have the 4 pillars part of existing building code. And that hasn't happened yet. So that's another priority that we're trying to unlock. So I'd say those are gonna be are sort of before we look back at what we might do with the stretch and specialize as they stand now. I mean, we might tweak a few things. I don't know, maybe like EV or PV readiness, things of that nature that could come up. But honestly, it hasn't been a priority we haven't started that discussion yet.
Hi, Esther with Bureau Household. Thanks, Paul. This was really good. I'm wondering if you're able to comment on some of the documentation changes that are coming, and yeah, just some examples of that.
So I can't go through the gory details, but so my colleague Ian very carefully mapped out, on a whiteboard with Theos on the phone, with PHI on the phone, like what do you need at which steps in the process, and went through that with each one of those separately to make sure that the way that C40732 is written is better aligned. I I was not part of those discussions in detail. What we used to have was generically written for both PS and PHI, and that was causing some confusion. So that's why we expanded it to be more specific to each. So I'm sorry, I can't comment on specifics because I wasn't part of that working group as much.
Amy again, GSK, Committee on the Environment. Just wondering, where can we get the new code? And is there a version where we have a compiled version? I know a lot of us use upcodes, a lot of us go to the IECC, but then we're always checking against the mass amendments. So I'm just wondering, is there, maybe I just have missed a link where it's been combined or?
Yeah, so, yeah, that's a really great reminder to bring this up. We did reorganize our website a few months ago to better have all the information you need in one place that flows down, so you don't have to like go different directions on the websites. So our colleague Becca Edson did that a few months ago, and it came out terrific. So we're gonna send that to these guys to distribute to all. So that website at least has organized now better. You know, it's like a quick link to the IECC it's based on, and it's all the amendments, and they're all sort of well organized, and it has the attachments for the guidelines, and everything's sort of in one place now. It used to be in disparate places. So we're able to get that. We have a contract underway with IECC in order to do a blended code that takes our amendments and puts them into one single document with the IECC words. And that is just stuck for various reasons. And so that has been held up and we're trying to get that unstuck. So at some point that will be done. And we are prevented from just doing it ourselves and publishing it by copyright. I just have to explain, sometimes when we put stuff in with the Secretary of State, we have to say like, you know, add this phrase between this word and that word. And so we have this, end up with like cryptic amendments, and we're forced to do that because of copywriting. We recently got a little bit more permission to have more words together, so it's not so cryptic.
Yeah.
But that's one of the, we do have a bunch of constraints we're working under from just being able to go out and do that totally sensible thing to do. That's government for you. So we do our best. So hopefully in the near future, we will have a single upcode style thing. That will be the official code for the state that brings those together. We don't have that yet, but at least we have things organized on the website much better.
You do your best. I think your best is pretty good, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You get a photo of this. Signing records. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, everyone here in person and online. We're going to be sharing this presentation afterwards online on our website. You can go to phmass.org. We'll be sending emails out about future events. Thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you again, Paul.
Thank you.